At the beginning of the reign of Peter I, the father of modern Russia as well as the Russian Navy, the northern region was the country's only access to the sea. Although Peter soon undertook campaigns to gain access to the Baltic and Black Seas, the Arctic coast remained vital to Russian trade. During World War I, the ports on the northern coast provided the route for Allied aid to the Tsarist regime, and then for the landings of US and British troops during the Civil War, 1917 to 1920. The first major Soviet naval units to be assigned to the region were the patrol ships Smersh and Urgan, and the submarines Debakharest and Narolowitz transited the newly completed Baltic White Sea Canal from Kronstadt to Murmansk in the summer of 1933. This was the start of the Northern Naval Flotilla. Reinforcements of ships and submarines followed. And in September 1935, a flight of MBR-2 flying boats were transferred to the Koala region to begin naval air operations in the northern area. The flotilla was reorganized as the Northern Fleet on 11th of May 1937 at the start of the Great Patriotic War in June 1941. The fleet had 15 submarines, 8 destroyers, 7 patrol ships, and numerous lesser craft, plus 116 naval aircraft. It was thus the smallest of the 4 fleets when the Soviet Union entered World War II. Those naval forces in the White Sea area were reorganized as the White Sea Flotilla in August 1941. The Northern Fleet participated in extensive combat operations against the German naval forces off northern Norway and Finland. The Arctic operating area was important to the United States and Britain for convoys carrying war material to the Soviet Union. The Baltic Fleet. History. Russian influence in the Baltic Sea area dates to 1703, when Peter I established a city in the marshes of the Neva River, where it enters the Gulf of Finland, naming the city St. Petersburg. I do love his ego. And making it the capital of Russia. He sought to bring Western influence to the country and envisaged St. Petersburg as a window on the West. The city's German-sounding name was changed to Petrograd in 1914, on the eve of war with World War I, and subsequently to Leningrad after Lenin's death in 1924. In 1721, forces under Peter, relying heavily on assistance from British and other foreign naval specialists, defeated the Swedes in a series of battles in the Gulf of Finland. These victories established Russia as a Baltic power and as a principal European state. Yes, the British helped set up the Russians as a power in the Baltic, and then they also helped the Swedes try and fight the Russians as a power in the Baltic, proving the old axiom that there is no such thing as constant, there is just interest in international relations. Russian activity and interest in the region grew rapidly under Peter's successors. This is one of the plans for an idea of what a Russian fleet could look like at some point in the future, in the 1950s. That is a Soviet Soyuz class battleship with missile launchers on it. Honestly, if the Soviet Union had built that ship with those missile launchers and that capability, we would be looking at something like a dreadnought race at some point. Anyway, to continue with Norman Palmer and his wonderful work here. The Baltic was the major theatre of combat between German and Russian naval forces in World War I. During the Bolshevik communist revolution that erupted in October 1917 against the Kerensky government, sailors from the Baltic Fleet were in the forefront of the revolutionaries. The crew of the cruiser Avora, moored in the Neva River, refused orders to get underway and fired blank rounds to signal the start of the Bolshevik assault on the Winter Palace and the Hermitage, side of the government that had replaced the Tsarist regime in Russia. Although the sailors had helped spark the revolution in 1917, by 1921 many were disillusioned with Lenin's former dictatorship. In February, they rioted in the city and seized control of the island naval base of Kronstadt on Kotlin Island of the Gulf of Finland. The Gulf was frozen over, and the island was taken by Bolshevik forces after a series of bloody assaults across the ice. The Baltic in 1918 and 1920 was also the scene of extensive British naval operations against communists, including highly successful torpedo boat attacks against anchored Russian battleships. Between the two world wars, Leningrad became the industrial and training center of the Soviet Navy. In June 1941, at the outbreak of the conflict, the Baltic Fleet was the largest of the Soviet naval forces, consisting of 2 battleships, 4 cruisers, 21 destroyers, 65 submarines, and numerous lesser craft, supported by 656 naval aircraft. German naval forces almost immediately gained control of the Baltic as German armies pushed north and east from Poland, eventually encircling Leningrad and being stopped almost within sight of Moscow. Pro-German Finland assisted in the war against the Soviet Union. I would disagree with the characterization of Finland as being pro-German. Anti-Russian, thanks to Russia keep invading them, is more the case. Trapped between a rock and a hard place, Finland. The Germans laid anti-submarine minefields and nets across the entrance of the Gulf of Finland to stop Soviet submarines from operating the Baltic. These measures include, plus German naval forces and the winter ice, limited effectiveness of the Baltic fleet. During the 3-year siege of Leningrad, the large caliber guns of the battleships and cruisers trapped in the port were used to provide fire support for Soviet ground forces. After the war, Leningrad's shipyards and other naval facilities were rebuilt, having had higher priority as part of Stalin's fleet rehabilitation program. Black Sea Fleet. Russian naval activities on the Black Sea can be traced to 1783, when ships from the Sea of Azov, visiting the village of Akh-Itar, renamed Sevastopol the following year. Subsequent Russian interest in the area led to a series of wars with Turkey during the late 18th and 19th centuries, with British and French naval forces at times being allied with those of Turkey, sometimes not. The Russians were highly innovative in tactics and weapons during their battles with the Turks, introducing rifled shells, among other developments. During this period, shipbuilding became a major activity along the Black Sea coast, especially at Nikolov on the Yuzhany Bug River, a short distance from the sea. At the start of the century, many sailors of the Black Sea Fleet, like their comrades in the Baltic, were consumed by revolutionary fervour. In the abortive attempt to board of revolt 1945, there was a much publicised mutiny on board the battleship Pontkin, an event made immortal in Sergei Eisenstein's classic film of 1925. I'm not that big a fan. During the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the subsequent Civil War, the British and French landed troops on the Black Sea coast to support the anti-Red forces in the area. After the success of the communists and the withdrawal of foreign fleets, the remnants of the Black Sea Fleet fled to North Africa, where they were interned. In May 1920, the new and established Bolshevik regime reorganized the naval forces of the Black Sea and Sea of Azov. These forces were redesignated the Black Sea Fleet on the 11th of January 1935. During the 1930s, the Black Sea region regained its importance in the shipbuilding and maritime industries. At the outbreak of the Great Patriotic War, please note, World War II, in June 1941, the Black Sea Fleet was the nation's second largest, with a single battleship, 6 cruisers, 3 destroyer leaders, 14 destroyers, 47 submarines, and 625 land-based aircraft. And, well, the Pacific Fleet. The Russians reached the Pacific, the coast of Siberia, in significant numbers in the mid-17th century. The towns of Andya and Oshkosh were founded in 1649. The area grew in importance at a rapid pace, largely because of trade with China and then with Japan. Commodore Matthew Calvert Perry, commander of the U.S. Navy's East Indies Squadron, forced the economic opening of Japan in 1853 to 54 to preempt a Russian squadron in the area and prevent the Tsar's officers from reaping the benefits of a treaty with Japan. Basically, America decided they had to go in and force Japan to open up, because if they didn't, the Russians were going to. They had no choice. It was either them or the Russians would do it. Of course, that would suggest they didn't see the subtlety of letting the Russians charge in, then charging in and assisting the Japanese in chucking the Russians out, and therefore buying the eternal friendship of the Japanese. Fairly sure that if the Russians had forced away in, the British might have done that before the Americans did it, to buy the eternal love of the Japanese. Sounds like something the British would do. Anyway, the Russian Okhotsk flotilla was formed in 1731, then reorganized and renamed the Siberian Naval Flotilla in 1836. In addition to the flotillas, the first Pacific Squadron was established. At the start of 1904 and 1905 war with Japan, the Russian Navy had 7 of its 15 modern battleships based at Port Arthur. The Japanese Navy had 6 modern battleships then in commission. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904-5 was a disaster for the Pacific Squadron, as well as for a large reinforcing fleet sent by the Russians from the Baltic and Black Seas. The Japanese triumph at the Battle of Tsushima on the 27th of May 1995 destroyed Russian naval power in the Pacific and established Japan as a world power. I'd argue destroyed Russian naval power everywhere because so much of their fleet was sunk. Yeah, well, or captured. After the war, the Russian Navy in the Far East consisted of the weakened Siberian Amur flotillas. After the revolution of 1917, Japanese and American troops landed at Vladivostok to support anti-communist forces and help remove a Czech army in central Russia that the Allies wished to transport to the European theatre. The Japanese left Siberia in 1922, after which the Soviets formed the Vladivostok Ship Detachment and the Amur Naval Flotilla in the Far East. These organizations were disbanded in 1926, with the ships and craft being assigned to border guards and the new Far Eastern Naval Flotilla. The naval units were organized as the Naval Forces of the Far East in April 1932. On the 11th of January 1935, as Soviet forces in the area increased, the title Pacific Fleet was assigned. Pacific Fleet aircraft were involved in fighting Japan in Manchuria in the late 1930s. Russian naval ships moved troops and material and evacuated wounded. When the Great Patriotic War began in Europe in June 1941, the Pacific Fleet consisted of 14 destroyers, 91 submarines, and numerous lesser crafts, and some 500 aircraft. These units were essentially idle during the war, with 147,000 men from the fleet being sent to fight as ground troops in the European theatre. When the Soviet Union attacked Japan in August 1945, the Pacific Fleet had 2 cruisers, 13 destroyers, 78 submarines plus other ships and craft, and 1,549 aircraft. During operations against Manchuria and Korea in the final days of the war, the fleet attacked Japanese shipping and supported ground operations with air attacks and logistic support. Several amphibious landings, largely unopposed, were made at ports along the coast of Korea, Sakhalin, and Kuri Islands. Some were undertaken in conjunction with parachute landings. Non-polar, the Naval Institute Guide to the Soviet Navy. That's a good book. It's a good starting point, and it's worthwhile considering some of the history. But let's go back and consider from the beginning some of the history. So, why do I have this here? Because this is the Russian fleet as it was feared it would be. If the Russians had launched that battleship with those missiles on it, as well as those guns and that armor, they would have put the Western nations in a very big bind. Because saying that aircraft carriers are now the more financially sensible route for a capital ship than a battleship is one thing. When no one else is building a battleship. But when someone else is building battleships and they are armed with missiles as well as festooned with lots of radar-guided guns, etc., and are part of task forces, then you suddenly are in a tougher place to make that case. And you're probably going to end up having to build your own. At least have to upgrade and modify Vanguard and a few others. And yes, there are some interesting discussions at certain points when people go, oh yes, well if we kept Vanguard to the 1980s, they wouldn't have had the manpower to crew it. They would have. Often you don't have the manpower to crew something if you don't have it in existence. If you have it in existence, you often have to try at least make an effort at having the manpower to crew it. There are various issues which go around that. Usually they come into the Tiger class cruisers in the Falklands War, and why weren't they activated? They'd have been very useful. They have huge helicopter facilities. However, it was finding enough people with the correct training was considered one obstacle. But the biggest obstacle was actually the level of maintenance that had been done on their engines and getting them ready in time. One naval architect who I've spoken with, not my dad, but actually a friend of my dad, unfortunately he's also not with us, who was involved in that process of assessing them, reckoned that every single hose and pipe and valve in the engine room of the engine rooms of one of the vessel he was looking around would have had to been replaced. Pretty much, you'd be talking about rebuilding the engine. That would not have been a quick job. Could Britain have managed it? Yes, if they felt they really needed it. But the trouble is trying to convince the government to put out the money, the Admiralty, that they really needed it. And it's only afterward people looked back and went, actually, having those 6-inch gun cruisers might have been helpful. But we are talking about a gun which didn't even properly debrief its senior officers when they came back. Fun times. But no, the Russians are a cruiser-based force. This is an interesting thing to point out. The Russians don't have many battleships in the interwar period. They don't have many battleships post World War II. They're building them, but they never actually complete them. Their big ships are cruisers. They are a cruiser navy. This is the reason why Britain keeps building cruisers. Why the Tiger class come into existence? Why do Americans rename a destroyer leader a cruiser? And a destroyer leader I'm talking about, of course, is the Ticos. Yeah, the Ticos. The Ticonderoga class. They're originally designed as destroyer leaders, but they're designated cruisers, so they're not even proper cruisers by the American sense. Because they are dealing with an enemy navy who is building cruisers. And sometimes you have to build what your opponent is building because politics, but also because there's probably a reason they're building it. And if you don't think you need to build it, are you quite sure that you know everything about why they're building them? It's like we've currently got a scenario going on where various nations are trying to redesign a version of the Junicole, i.e., the small flotilla integrated navies fighting together. Now, admittedly, those things are going to have the same problems they've always had. Communications. You need to be able to guarantee communications and coordination to keep that flotilla fighting together. And 2, there's the efficiency of the hull. As a ship gets bigger, you can cram more weapons as percentage volume into the hull. Hence, if you look at the sort of difference between the Constellation class, the Barley Burkes and the Sejong the Greats, etc., and the amount of weapons they stack in there. And it's the same if we go back to sort of looking at cruisers, etc., destroyers, all these ships in the 1920s and 1930s. Larger ships tend to be more efficient. They tend to provide you with more capabilities and more firepower. And usually what decides the size of ship you're building are the capabilities you want from it. This is very much the case with the Soviet Union. It's what they want from ships which is deciding what they're building. You would think if you are planning on building a defensive navy that you would be concentrating on flotillas. You'd be going full Junicole, destroyers, submarines. But no, they're putting huge amount of effort into building cruisers. Stalin wants to build battleships. But cruisers are what get built. Because every level, the Soviet Union knows it needs cruisers. Because to fight a defensive war, you need to be able to go offensive in fighting peace. Ah, yes, there's that phrase, which I do bring up a lot, but people sometimes get confused. What do I mean by fighting peace? It's how you shape the battlefield of war. The naval diplomacy battle, the maritime security, the global presence battle, contest. All these things are how you shape the battle to come, how you shape the battle space, how you show you are a reliable ally that's worthwhile throwing your lot in with in peacetime so that in wartime they're on your side. How you show nations who might be teetering the other way it's better to stay neutral because we turn up far more regularly than anyone else does. We have far more of an understanding of this area than anyone else does. Do you really want to? And it's important, especially when you're aiming for great power status, or at least power status, that you have a presence. If you don't have a presence, you don't matter. As I've tried to explain several times, decisions are made by those who show up. If you don't show up, you don't have a seat at the table. If you don't have a seat at the table, you're not involved in the decision-making process, so don't expect them to consider your interests or your desires. They won't. That's the fundamental rule of international relations. If you're not there, you don't count. So for the Soviet Union to have its ability to influence things, it needs to have presence. Now, the Chapyev class I would consider a great step on this. They are the Projekt 68s. Now, please note, the Sveldov class are an evolution of these. But these themselves are an evolution of the Kirov class, which I talked about in the last video on the Soviet cruisers. The interesting thing is this: they replaced the three triple 7.1-inch guns, the 180mm guns, with four triple 152mm guns. That's 6-inch guns. So they basically go, look around the world. Yeah, we've got the options in this world of building 9 8-inch gun ship, roughly 9 8-inch guns. 7.1 is what we can build, but 9 8-inch guns is what we're aiming for. Or 12 6-inch guns. And they go very British with the 12 6-inch guns. In fact, I would argue a lot that the Chapyev class, despite the Italian roots of the Kirov class, are very, very British in terms of their approach to layout and armament and organization. Now, they are interesting in that, well, the 8th October 1939, the Zelenskov is laid down the 31st of October 1939. The Khrushchev is laid down on the 31st of August 1939. The Shiklov is laid down the 31st of August 1939. And the Hruns is laid down the 29th of August 1939. So theoretically, by my count, they should have been called the Frunz class, because the Chapyev is actually the second to last to be laid down. However, she is launched the 28th of April 1941. Okay. And that means, well, she's still one of the last to actually be launched. And she's even one of the last to be completed. So I'm presuming they just really liked Vasily Chapyev, who of course had been a Russian soldier, Red Army commander during World War I and during the Russian Civil War. And luckily, considering what happens after the war, he dies in 1919. So that means he can no longer be purged. He's died for the motherland. So that makes him great if you're naming a ship after him from the Soviet Navy's perspective. Because there's going to be no, we now need to rename ships later on because of, issues. Which does actually happen with Chekhov. Because this is called Cosmonauts by this point. Originally named after Valery Chekhov, who was a test pilot, awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union, and He died in 1938. But his name wasn't considered great enough. So, yeah, they changed it to Cosmonauts. Which is, of course, the all-union Leninist Young Communist League. Usually known as Cosmol. Cute. What are these ships about? These ships are about providing the Soviet Navy with offensive diplomatic power and wartime command facilities for fleet command fighting in the littoral environments. They're also about being able to engage forces, especially enemy destroyer forces, with as dense a range of fire as possible. Now, the fact is, most of them, well, in fact, all of them, don't enter service till Chapyev is 16th of May 1950. Zelenskov is the 19th of April 1950. The Kishiev is the 22nd of December 1950. The Shuklov, aka Cosmonauts here, 1st November 1950. And the Huns is the 15th of December 1950. So, yeah, they're all in commission 1950. A few years after the war has been over, and, well, they were sort of delayed by war, let's be honest. When you've got these ships being at some points surrounded, for example, the ones in Leningrad, surrounded by German soldiers, you're probably not going to finish building it. You're probably not going to. But what are you building? Well, you're building a ship which is 11,310 tons in standard, or 14,310 tons fully loaded. 201 meters in length, 19.7 meters in beam, 6.4 meters in draft. It has 6 boilers supplying 2 geared steam turbines to drive 2 shafts with 124,000 shaft horsepower for a top speed of 33.5 knots or a range of 7,000 nautical miles at 19 knots, which is pretty darn good. Let's be honest. 7,000 nautical miles at 19 knots is fast. And good range. Complement 840, showing a pretty crew power intensive operation of a vessel, but not out of line with with other vessels of similar size. Armament 12 6-inch guns in 4 triple turrets, 8 3.9-inch or 100mm guns in 4 twin turrets, 28 37mm AA guns, because why have 40mm? Seriously. Everyone else in the world at this point is going for 40mm as fast as they can go, and the Soviets are going, no, 37. We have to be different. 6 533mm, that's 21-inch torpedo tubes, which were later removed. But again, it's important to remember that still, even in the 1950s, torpedoes are the recognized major anti-ship weapon, not missiles yet. Yeah, they have capabilities, but those things are nowhere near refined or at the level at which you want to rely on them. Torpedoes do. Belt, 100mm of armor. Conning tower, 150mm. Deck, 550mm. And turret, 75mm. They were supposed to carry 2 seaplanes and 1 catapult to support them. These were all later removed. Very sensibly, although there are some pictures of them with them on around. So, when would they have been completed if war hadn't happened? This is the interesting point, and this is where we turn to the other book of this that I've been using for their sources. Now, this, of course, is Stalin's Ocean-Going Fleet by Jürgen Rohr and Michael S. Monakov. And, well, in this we find a lot of very interesting chapters about strategy and building plans and the ideas. Now, I would say this comes into the strategic considerations in 1935 to 36, as that sort of filters into that period. But by the point you get to the Chapyev class, you've got another section of this book called New Leaders and New Strategy in 1939. And this is what they write. On 28th April 1939, Stalin appointed a young, new commander of the Pacific Fleet, N.G. Kuznetsov, as Narcom for the VMF. He was only 36 years old. So basically, if I wanted to match that, I've got less than a year to become commander of the Pacific Fleet of Russia. I don't think I can do it. I don't know. I'll give it a go. In 1934, he had become the commanding officer of the cruiser Shevna Ukrainia of the Black Sea Fleet, and from 1936-37 was a captain for one Ragna of naval attaché and senior advisor to the Spanish Republican Navy, when he was recalled to become the first deputy and then commander of the Pacific Fleet. Notwithstanding the fact that he was the responsible commander of the fleet when the new destroyer Rashimaneri was wrecked on the 5th November 1938 in a storm during the transfer from the Amur yard to Vladivostok for final equipment, he was called to give a speech at the Party Congress in Moscow in early 1939. Stalin seems to have liked his energetic young man, and so decided to make him head of the Navy during the difficult time of building the big ocean-going fleet. He got two specialists from the Imperial Navy who were exempted from the purges as deputy commanders of the VMF, and his chief advisors, L.M. Gala as chief of the main staff, and I.S. Izekov as head of the shipbuilding department. Gala was 56 years old, had entered the Navy in 1905, commanded several destroyers, and in 1917 became commander of the pre-dreadnought battleship Andrea Pervosiana. He decided to join the Red Fleet and served mostly with the Baltic Fleet, first as chief of staff and then as commander. Isakov was 45 years old and had entered the Navy when the First World War began. As a young midshipman ensign in 1917, he had taken command of the destroyer Isla and transferred this new ship from Tallinn to Petrograd, joining the Red Fleet. He had served in the Caspian Flotilla and the Baltic and Black Sea fleets before he became chief of staff. I don't think we'll jump yet. He of the Baltic Fleet from 1930 to 1937. The fleets also got new commanders. In May 1939, V.F. Tributz took command of the Baltic Fleet, and in August, F.S. Oktyabrsky of the Black Sea Fleet and I.S. Umachev of the Pacific Fleet. The Northern Fleet had already been taken over by V.P. Drozd, but in July 1940, A.G. Govoko, who transferred from the Caspian Flotilla, took over. In the several river flotillas, there were also great changes in leading positions. The new leadership of the Navy forced through in mid-1939 a thorough revision of the operational tasks of the future big ocean-going fleet, and a correction of the tactical data for a number of combat units demanded to solve the main strategic missions. Also, a new version of the explanatory note to the shipbuilding program, 1940-47, was written. Now the main enemy was assumed to be Japan. Japanese attack against China in 1937-38, which led to the capture of most harbors on the Chinese coast and the areas along the rivers and railways, and the Japanese attempt to capture some hills at Kashan Lake in August 1938 had augmented Soviet Stalin's fears. The commander-in-chief in the Far East, the highly decorated Marshal Bukia, was denounced by the new chief of the political administration, L.S. Malklis, for not having followed orders from Marshal Voroshlov, which aroused Stalin's suspicions. Bukia was arrested in October and died of a heavy torture during the NKVD investigations in 9th November 1938. Stalin's fears led to a change in the rankings of fleets, with the Pacific Fleet becoming the top one, pushing the Baltic Fleet into second place. It was estimated that the Japanese would be able to deploy against the Soviet Pacific Fleet 8 old battleships, 4 aircraft carriers, 8 heavy cruisers of the 10,000-ton Taiko and Miyako classes, 12 light cruisers, 32 destroyers, a number of submarines, and many auxiliaries. In the Sea of Okhotsk, the Japanese formations are expected to include 2 old battleships, 3 aircraft carriers, 4 cruisers of the Kurgasa and Kako classes, as well as 6 light cruisers. It was supposed that both enemy formations would get reinforcements if needed. In addition, the Soviets estimated that the Japanese would be able to confront the Pacific Fleet with 83 ships, including 6 light cruisers and 60 old destroyers. It was expected the Japanese Navy would conduct landing operations, support army formations, fighting on the land fronts, and the Soviet experts supposed that the Japanese were able to strike at the base of the Pacific Fleet and to carry out raids against commerce and fisheries. It was estimated, therefore, that the Pacific Fleet should include no fewer than 15 battleships, 13 heavy, 26 light cruisers, and 130 destroyers to be able to fight successfully against the Japanese Navy. But the Soviet experts realized that it was impossible to get such a number of units into the active list. Therefore, in 1947, the Pacific Fleet would include 6 battleships of Project 23, 2 battlecruisers of Project 69, 12 cruisers of Project 68, 36 destroyers of Project 30, and 30 patrol ships. This is Project 68. They're good books. They're also why the Soviet Union is building ships. Although I do find it amazing that the Soviet Union was thinking that, yeah, we can build up to 15 ships for the Pacific Fleet alone, as well as presumably having a Baltic, Black Sea, and Northern Fleet. And we can do it by 1947. This is why I often refuse opportunities to call Plan Z, the German one, as the most fanciful of all the construction plans of nations in that period. That it really wasn't. That was the Soviet one. You have the Japanese one, which has some basis in reality because they actually have some of the infrastructure they need. You have the German one, which has none of the infrastructure they need. And you have the Soviet one, which includes the ability to use infrastructure, which is not only not yet completed, hasn't even got the infrastructure built which is needed to support the construction of the infrastructure that needs to be built in order to start even having a chance of approaching constructing the stuff needed to construct the ships, let alone support and sustain them. It's a fun history. But this is what the Soviet Union is building. What they are building, Project 68, are going to be essential to it. They are going to be more essential than they're being considered now at this point, because the ships that are supposed to be built alongside them, the battleships, the battle cruisers, the aircraft carriers, none of them get built. None of them get built. They get started, they don't get completed. But the Project 68 ships, they get completed, and they become the big ships, the cornerstones of Soviet power projection. The modern Russian Navy, the cruiser-centered force, is a product of this. And in many respects, the modern Chinese Navy is also it, which is why I often caution people when they start looking at the Chinese and start presuming models which are based on Western history. Because if you're pursuing a fleet which is more about shaping the peace than fighting the war, because you realize that necessarily fighting a war is not necessarily what your fleet's going to be good for, no matter what you do, then you make very different decisions. And if you fight the peace well enough, if you shape the battle space well enough in peacetime, you just might win the war despite not having a fleet which is positioned or designed or large enough or technologically good enough to win the war. It wouldn't be the first time in history that a weaker power has won a war thanks to their shaping of the conflict before the war began. And it wouldn't be the first time in history weaker powers have won wars because the larger powers haven't bothered to shape the conflict properly because they thought they didn't need to. And this is going back through history and to current affairs and future ones. Chapyev class are what you build in the 1930s, late 1930s, early 1940s, and 1950s if you want to shape that world, if you want to fight the peace or win the peace. Now, finding a decent picture of Chapyev herself is frigging difficult. So instead, I found this. It's a lovely picture of her. She's a cute ship. Now, here is where me and Norman have some slight differences because he writes this. The 7 Chapyev class light cruisers were laid down 1938 to 1940. No, they were all laid down 1939. There is a different definition of laying down, though, and I can see why he's spreading it out to 1940, because some of us consider laying down when they actually start constructing and actually put a stuff. Some of us consider laying down when they've actually put a component there. It's a line of difference. Full load displacement was 15,000 tons, with a main battery of 12 5.9-inch guns. They're 152mm, not 150mm. But, yeah. All construction stopped when the Soviet Union entered the war in June 1941. Mostly they didn't enter the war, remember they were invaded, and mostly their construction stopped because their yards got run over. 2 ships are officially listed as cancelled, but those vessels, the Orozensky and the Svoldov, were on the slipway when they were captured by Germans in Nikolaev during World War II. So, yeah, that ain't gonna happen much. Now, what is interesting is that these ships which are built get a paragraph. The battle cruisers which aren't built get about a third of a column. In fact, these early cruisers get overlooked by so many worthy people, mostly because when they're looking at them, they're looking through the eyes of the Cold War. And they're looking through those of the military power and the military capabilities. And these cruisers don't look like military capabilities. When you're writing in the 1970s, looking back, knowing what comes soon afterwards, knowing what's built, knowing what comes of age, knowing the world as it becomes, these can look like Stalin's follies. They're not. They are not for 2 reasons. As said, their warfighting capability. Yes, you have 5. You also have the Kirov class. Well, the vessels, those which are in service still. Roughly 6. And, you have the Svelov class, which come after these, which are built with the full experience of World War II. You have, therefore, a lot of cruisers to go around. The cruisers are status ships. They can inspire your own populations, they can lead your own local forces, and this is always an option. They can be sent around the world to be your presence. And that's a factor. Having cruisers is a capability. Having cruisers provides you with presence. Now, for the Soviet Navy, one of the problems is that their biggest goes. Stalin goes. And the people who follow him are different. I would like to be able to say they are better in some ways, but honestly, I can't think of many who are better in some ways. Khrushchev. He does bloodless purges, at least. But the people who follow him are either very army land power centric in their thought process and absolute power in terms of their military centric ideas, or they just don't see naval power as mattering. Because they think of it in terms of the Soviet Union. Naval power for the Soviet Union has never been about them. The Soviet Union has humongous land borders to trade over. They have huge amounts of natural resources if it's properly run and managed. Theoretically, like America, their economy could be pretty much self-sufficient. Theoretically. However, the reality is very different, especially in a world where you basically rely on everyone else innovating as well as yourself to be able to innovate across the board at all times in order to propel standard of living and technological capabilities and all these things forward. But the also thing is, you have these cruisers to shape the battle space, but also to shape the battle space in the mind of your opponents. Cruisers, for their cost, can deliver an outsized level of threat and problem in the minds of your opponents. How? Why? Surface raiders. The Soviet Union were probably, how do I put this, the greatest students of German naval philosophy and practice in World War II of any nation. They were the original. In fact, not just the original, they were the original and the greatest. Werbus. Werbus. Actually, no, they weren't even that. They weren't even that big a fan of the rest of the German. No, they were Spähbusch. The Grafspee. That was their joy. The Deutschland class. Looking at what they did, that was what they were obsessed with. The sheer amount of forces those ships tied down, the impact German surface vessels had on convoy protections, convoy security requirements, convoy routing, all these things were of absolutely overwhelming interest to the Soviet Union because they were looking at it and going, submarines, good. They can fight the battle. They can't win it. Why can't they win the commerce battle? Why can't submarines win the commerce battle? Because if they're fighting on their own, they're one plane of threat and your opponent can adjust to them, especially if they see it coming in peacetime. So you need to have multiple planes of threat in order to really threaten commerce and trade. If you can undermine the movement of commerce and trade, you can undermine the movement of forces. And if you can undermine the movement of forces, you can undermine the cohesion of alliances, because allies on the front line are not sure if allies in the back will manage to get their troops through to you. So why do you take the chance that they will and rely on it? If you can't rely on it, what value is the alliance? If there's no value in the alliance, why keep to the alliance? Soviet cruisers were never about fighting wars. If they did fight in the war, and they did well, great. If they didn't do well, that didn't matter. What mattered was the trouble it created in the minds of NATO and the Allies. The Soviet Navy was about, as I said, fighting the peace. They're about the threat of what they represented rather than the reality of what they represented. There is a difference, though, between the cruisers which were built and what I think the admirals were planning and what Stalin was planning. Here we have the Sovietsky Soyuz in Leningrad being built alongside the Shutov, later of course, the cosmonauts. And the photo is courtesy of the Luftwaffe in 26th of June 1941. And it gives you a real idea of how far along these vessels are in terms of their completion. Let's be honest, there is a lot of work already being done on the Shutov. The Soyuz needs a lot of work. But the cruisers always got the emphasis of work. The capital ships were how the Navy kept Stalin interested. He was obsessed with the big guns, like pretty much every other dictator in the world has ever been and will ever be. They're always obsessed with big guns. But the Navy were trying to deliver something which is a realistic capability for the Soviet Union. Now, in the 1920s and 1930s, part of the Soviet Union's mantra was the exporting of communism. Was the exporting of their political system and ideals, for want of a better phrase. And for growing the power and influence of the Soviet Union. Part of it was also a realization that there were still threats to them. Japan was obviously quite highly up there. Again, many nations presume Japan is a far greater threat than Nazi Germany or Italy. Nazi Germany or fascist Italy. Principally, I would argue, because they are the third largest naval power, or rather, technically, we consider it the UK and the US are supposed to be equal, the second largest naval power in the world. And one of the interesting things that they don't consider in their own studies, the Soviets, if they start building up their fleet quite so big, how's that going to have an impact on everyone else? Let's be honest, the Soviet Union's construction and the announcements of what they were constructing were part of the reasoning that the Japanese tried to give at some point for their own leaving of the treaty system. Franz. This is her when she's under construction and, well, using a floating dry dock. The Soviet Navy is therefore already to an extent achieving its goal of diplomatic presence, even before it's got its ships in service, which is no reason for them to build them. And they're a realistic belief in how they're going to work. You see, there is a problem when it comes to analysing the Soviet Navy, and a fair number of people tend to fall into this. And I'm always tell people, especially those people who jump into international relations and military history from other fields, be very careful. Some of the rhetoric has been around for such a long time and has got so many layers to it that it can look indistinguishable from fact because it's just been around so long. That's a scary thing to think about, but one of the things that starts off in this period, especially around the capital ships, but to an extent around other ships as well for the Soviet Navy, is that they are building a navy to contest control of the blue waters. They are building a navy to contest the oceans. Now, if you were doing that, and I mean really doing that, and that was your focus, considering the way the Soviet command economy worked, and the nature of the 5-year plans, and the ability to chuck huge volumes of people at them, then even though I would personally say that it's far better to build the cruisers first and get the experience building them before you build the capital ships, so you build up your knowledge, the capital ship should have been the emphasis of your construction. The capital ship should have been the focus. They're how you achieve control of the sea. They're how you contest control of the oceans, not cruisers. Stalin is still alive after World War II is over. He's alive for many years after World War II is over. If truly a dictator of that power post World War II is talking and is believing that he is building a fleet to contest the world's oceans, contest control of the oceans, he's not going to be happy with just submarines and cruisers. He's going to be building the ships which you need to contest them. If his real intent, and if the intent of his navy and his government really, truly matches the rhetoric. There is, though, the very real option that the rhetoric is just another part of the overall discussion to maximize their real aim. Because if you do not announce you're doing a building plan to contest the peace, to shape a potential battlefield, to fight the naval diplomatic effort, you don't do that. That's not going to get you money, and it doesn't get you respect. And everyone looks at you and goes, those are vague and things we can't really put down. We can't really put values on that, numbers on that. You have to elucidate an argument which is made in a position and from a position of strength. So you talk about your capital ships. Yes, the Soviet Union has weaknesses when it comes to building these things. They have huge infrastructure issues. But that's not the same as saying they couldn't do it if Stalin really wanted to. Because, as we started out with one of the chapters and sections I read out earlier from one of the books, when he wants to, he just gets rid of commanders who don't deliver on what he wants them to. And whilst it might not give you quality, being prepared to kill people for failing to deliver exactly what you want in exactly the way you want them, does tend to get you something approaching what you want when you want it. If Stalin had wanted a navy to contest the oceans in wartime, he would have got those capital ships. He would have got those battle cruisers. He would have got those battleships. But I don't think even before World War II, they really wanted that. I think even before World War II, the real queens of the Soviet Navy were always going to be the cruisers. Were always going to be the ships which could go out and shape the image of the Soviet Union around the world, which could threaten trade, could provide the Soviet Union with presence, could provide the Soviet Union with something to flex their muscles in things, scenarios like the Spanish Civil War, etc., a voice at the table, a seat at the table, decision making. That was what these ships were about, and that's what these ships would give them. And for that, they had to look good, and they had to be flexibly armed. But they also had to have range and speed, which is what the Chapyev class have. Why do you need range? So you can get out there. Why do you need speed? So you can get out there quickly. Because the odds are you're not going to have ships out there permanently. You don't have enough. So that's the Chapyevs. Next class in this series is going to be, well, my favorites. The Sverdlovs. I do like the Sverdlovs. You will find an article I wrote about them years ago on what it was first up to put on the British Naval History site, and then that became the Global Maritime History site, and it's still up there on the Global Maritime History site, and that's the article will be the basis of a lot of the stuff I'll be talking about. And they're technically the Projekt 68 this, i.e., they take the Projekt 68 idea of cruisers and they put in all their World War II experience, and all the World War II experience they get from the Germans, from German archives and German personnel they capture, from Italians and who they captured, and from Americans and British sources where they can get the information. And they build the very best cruisers they can. Next week, we have the Town class, Birmingham and Birkenheads. And in October, we have the Daedalus class, Projekt BC 304 of Earth. Mighty, mighty ships. Right. Thank you very much for watching. This week we have Patron 62, Daniel Freeman's What If the French Navy had left France and carried on the fight in 1940, which should be interesting. And thank you very much again for all your support. I hope the sound and everything on this video is good. I hope you have enjoyed the topic. I am going to finish off with a question, but I haven't got to it yet. I want to say thank you to all my subscribers and all my patrons, and all the people who've joined the channel. Basically, everyone who gives me financial support to do this history, because I couldn't do it without your support. Especially couldn't do the things I've got coming and planning in terms of the new computer system, etc., to hopefully improve everything and improve the qualities. So thank you very much again. And the question. And so this is right at the end, so it's going to be a test of money to see how many you watch all the way to the end. The question is this. I, of course, was talking about how a navy was being built, was being marketed as a navy to contest control the world's oceans. Actually, what was being built was a navy to contest the world's diplomacy. There are also examples in history of navies which were the other way around, where they were marketed as being, this is about our diplomatic, our presence, our maritime security. No, it's nothing to do with warfighting capability. And actually, it's building a warfighting force. There are 4 good examples and about 24 other potential examples of that. I'm not going to list any of them, but I'd love to hear if you know where they are or what they are, and have thoughts on them. Thank you very much. Hope you had a nice day and hope you enjoyed the video. Take care.